As you begin your ministry at a new church, you're going to make changes. It's a given. It's not up for debate. However, how you make those changes is incredibly important. We're going to continue a conversation about different questions to ask before you implement major change on this episode of the Starting Well podcast. Welcome to the Starting Well podcast. Whether you are a new pastor or you're beginning to serve in a new church, this podcast is designed to help you start well. I'm your host, Jason Lowe, and I serve as a regional consultant with the Kentucky Baptist Convention. And I am so glad that you've joined us for this episode. Let's get started. All right, welcome back for another episode. My name's Jason. I'm so glad you're here. And you are actually jumping into the middle of a conversation that I began having last week with Jeff Crabtree. Jeff serves as the South Central Regional Consultant for the Kentucky Baptist Convention. And we began a conversation last week about this topic of questions that a new pastor should consider asking before implementing change. And this was a great conversation, but we did talk about the first three questions last week. And so I would encourage you to go back and listen to the previous episode, but just in case you don't have time to do that and you just want to jump right into this conversation, let me quickly give you those first three questions that we talked about. Number one, have I prayed about this change? Number two, who will be responsible for making this decision about change? And number three, what will this change cost? So those were three great questions, and I would encourage you to go back and listen to that episode sometime. But now I'm going to continue with the last three questions. And so sit back, relax, and enjoy the remainder of my conversation with Jeff Crabtree. So far, we've talked about three of the six questions. Number one, have I prayed about this change? Number two, who will be responsible for making this decision about change? And number three, what will this change cost? So now let's talk about question number four. How does this change affect our mission and vision?
Yeah, when you think about how does this change affect our mission and vision, let me just kind of quickly define. We think about a mission statement and a vision statement, and I love that these are not my definitions, just stuff I've picked up. But, that mission statement will focus the church on what it does every day to achieve the vision. And the vision statement keeps the church focused on what the church hopes to be tomorrow. So today, this is our mission statement because it's pointing towards our vision of where we're going. I'm a member of a church that has a pretty pronounced vision, and it's about evangelism. The pastor of that church wants to know, if we're going to do this, how will this impact evangelism? And, that's just the vision of the church. And the mission is saying, well, what can we do today to impact eternity for some folks? So many times there's not a clear mission or vision statement when a pastor gets to a church, or it's somebody else's mission and vision statement. Jason, I'm sure you've seen this, where a new pastor comes and he writes the mission and vision statement and presents it to the congregation. Well, that never becomes the church's mission and vision statement, by the way. I've not seen it. Have you?
No, not at all.
Yeah. But I mean, I'm not criticizing his work. I'm just criticizing how he did it. But if the church has a really pronounced mission and vision statement, then everything should fall under that. Because in community, I think that's why we have so many churches. Let's just talk about Kentucky right now. We say at the KBC that we got, 2,350 churches at any given time. And we've got so many communities out here. Some leaders would say we've got too many churches, and we've got other leaders saying we need to plant more. Well, one of the reasons that we have so many churches is because every church has its niche for its vision. And so if we're looking as a pastor and I'm newly arriving at the church and I see that our mission, our vision statement is this, and let's just say, go back to my church, the church I'm a part of. If we start wanting to push that we want to do, let's say, food giveaways, and that's all we want to do is do food giveaways, that we don't want to tie it to the evangelism, then that doesn't fit under our mission and vision. To be benevolent without having evangelism tied to it, that would be something. So as we look at these changes, where does that fit under our mission and vision statement? I've got a tool where you take your mission and vision statement and you identify the ministries that fall under that mission and vision statement, and it's aligning those missions to that. What you may have to do is to develop. I did this for a church one day. We found like 3 ministries that didn't fall under their mission and vision. 2 of those ministries were long-term ministries. I'll say it that way and smile. And what they had to do was to reorganize those ministries to pull them back under the mission and vision statement. If we were to do this, then it would fit. But I think it's essential for a pastor, and I said it in here, is not to blaze a new trail when you've got a mission and vision that's there.
I've heard this question asked in different ways. And I remember one pastor, anytime any type of change was being introduced in his church, he would ask this question, very similar to what you've shared. Is this change mission critical?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it critical to our mission?
Yeah.
If it is, then you may indeed want to keep moving forward with that change. If it's not, that doesn't mean you don't make the change,
Yeah.
but it means that you need to seriously consider maybe the ramifications of that change. All right, so far we've talked about 4 questions. Number 5, and I love this question, is what are the speed of change for our congregation? And Jeff, before you answer that or talk about that question, I want to reference a quote that you made in the article. Again, you can find that article at startingwell.net, but you said this: change has a speed limit and it is not the same pace or the same limit for every church. I just thought that was so helpful. So would you talk to us about the speed of change for the congregation?
What I find in doing the work I do, we could go into 4 congregations in a day, and the pastor's working on an idea of change. One church would change rather quickly, and one church wouldn't, depending on the size of that change. But every congregation has a speed limit of change. I remember a church that I was a member of and on staff in that church, and that church didn't have a limit of change. It had a person of change. That person, during a business meeting, it was like everybody turned their head and looked at him, and ever how he voted, that's how they voted. So he was the person of change. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about once you start thinking about implementing change, how fast should it take? And I think one way that we can determine the speed of change, especially if we're talking about new pastors here, or maybe new to this church pastorate, is maybe go back and begin reading some of the old church business meetings records. I think you'll find that if something was talked about 2 years ago and they're still talking about it today, and you see the value of that change, you'll determine the speed limit there. Go back and look at if they have published deacons minutes. Go back and look at some of those and see how long they may have talked about that in a deacons meeting for 3 years, and it took the church 2 more years to get that done. I think about some of those places could be staffing. Staffing has a speed limit on it so that everybody's on board. If you got a church that you want to bring on a full-time person dealing with children, for instance, that's an emotional place. And so all of your younger families, yeah, we want that. And all your grandparents, we want that. But then the whole church has to be kind of moving together. And so I do think you've got to understand what is that. I think another way that you can designate change this is extremely important for pastors get to know their congregation as quickly as they can. Identify some folks that are godly people. I mentioned that a few minutes ago, that person of peace. Who is that person of peace that's looked at and from the church's perspective? There's an old book that Robert Dale wrote that's a great book. It's called To Dream Again. In that book, Dale writes about all these different types of people. And the type of person I'm talking about, Robert Dale would call the quarterback in the church. This is the lay person that the people would go to and ask for advice in times of difficulty. And so when I can hear that and I listen to that and I heed that, it helps me to know how quickly change can happen. And there may be more than one. You may find that person of peace and ask that person of peace, who else might help me to get a handle on this? I don't know if we want negative Nancy or negative Norman, but we want realistic Rob. I'm quite amused at sometimes because, this speed of change sometimes could really depend upon the situation itself.
All right, so we've talked about 5 questions thus far. Have I prayed about this change? Who will be responsible for making this decision about change? What will this change cost? How does this change affect our mission and vision? What is the speed of change for our congregation? And then the last question that you mentioned is, how will we know the change is beneficial?
Being beneficial is what you're hoping for. It's not just doing busy work. There's enough to do in ministry without adding to the load. And so, if our desire is to make changes that are appeasing and revealing of the gospel and extending the ministry, we've got to understand, since we've made this change, how beneficial is it? And, even before you make it, as I visualize that change, the question I use a lot is, okay, let's say we're 5 years out now after that change. What would be a victory for us? And that's kind of what I'm talking about. What's the victory a year out or 2 years out or whatever you want to use? And so I think we've got to decide what we want to look like, but we've also got to prove once we get there that this was important. So I think what we have to do is keep good notes. I don't know where this statement came from, but I've just embraced it. And it's that God never wastes anything. In God's economy, he wastes nothing. And I think the neat thing about that for me, what I've seen him do for me is when I'm up against a very hard decision and I've prayed about it and saw how he worked through that, it made it easier to make that decision the second time or something similar to that because I'm watching for what he's doing. So if I keep good notes and I inquire with the leaders as we're going through this change, how do you think that's going? Should we have tweaked that a little bit? I mean, we want to keep going towards that mission, but how did that look? That helps us to determine the value of the change to our church or to the community. So I think we've got to ask ourselves that question. Painting the future view or the future picture of the church is important in making that, in the early part of making that change. But then taking after you've made the change and go back to that early picture, does it look like what we thought it would? And my hope is you would say, it looks better than I thought it would. God did something in the midst of that to cause something to look so much better than we had even thought. I challenged the congregation yesterday going through a difficult time, and they are getting ready to celebrate an anniversary. And so they were talking about some of the past, and I knew some of the past, and I said, but here's the great thing. God's got a greater desire for your future to be brighter than the bright past that you've had.
Amen.
That's God's economy, and
Yeah.
that's what He wants. So,
Amen. Well, thank you again for writing this article and sharing these 6 questions that I think are very helpful for a new pastor. But before we let you go, just a couple other questions. In your article, you talked about how a new pastor has a certain amount of leadership capital. I think you used the term leadership bucks when they begin. Can you explain that concept for our listeners a little more?
first pastor I served with, we were driving up the road one day, And he said, Jeff, he says, you got some ministry money in your pocket. And he said, you get to determine how you spend it. And he said, as you do ministry, sometimes you get money, you get ministry bucks added to your pocket. And so you get more ministry bucks. But sometimes you're going to lose some. And sometimes during change, you spend some of your leadership dollars, your leadership bucks. You're going, I'm going to cash this in because it's important for the church. But I think your ministry bucks are spent when the people are going, Jason, I really trust your leadership. This looks like a really hard course you've got us on, but I trust your leadership. So what that's saying is I trust those leadership bucks you have. You're going to spend a little, but you're moving the church forward. And so understanding that you have so many leadership bucks to spend, I think it's very sobering to me working with these churches that I do when a pastor has spent all of his leadership bucks and he can't understand why people are not following him. And so a sense of self-awareness is important when you handle this. I think an amazing amount of having a good mentor and an encourager for you, not a person that is that person that just is your yes man or yes woman.
When you use that term leadership bucks, I think that's a very practical illustration of the concept that we've been trying to communicate over and over on this podcast, is that you can only lead if you have earned the trust of your congregation. You can only lead effectively. And
Yeah.
so I think when you're talking about that ministry money, that's really what you're talking about there.
Yeah.
Is have you earned enough trust that they can follow you through this change?
Yeah.
If you haven't, then they're going to be resistant to that change. They're not going to follow you. And if you continue to push through, and as you've given some examples of some of those pastors, that's when major conflict usually shows itself.
And you can retain some money and you can build back. But man, when you get to nothing left in your reserve, it's a time. I loved what the great Dan Garland said one day when he was in church in Henderson. He said he had pushed and moved and they come to a place where they were at a cross point. He said he stood before the church one day and he says, I've come to the decision after prayer that you're a church that needs a new pastor. And they just all started, well, you can't leave, Pastor Dan. So, well, you need a new pastor. And he said, I've come to the point where as a pastor, I need a new church. And they said, well, you can't leave, Pastor Dan. You just can't leave. And he says, I tell you what, I'll be your new pastor if you'll be my new church.
Wow.
And I think that's kind of insightful there, that at that point, he got to start over again. The church started over again. I don't want us to paint the picture that a man can continue to make mistakes and not be useful, because I think he can. God can redeem that time. But I thought it was really wise that Dan came to that place where he could share that. And I hope somebody's listening to that today can find some benefit in that story.
Amen. Amen. So, Jeff, is there a resource or two that you would recommend to help new pastors think carefully about implementing major change? And not really even just new pastors, but every pastor. Any resources that come to mind?
Yeah, I think there's a few. I think the Lead to Revitalization is a good practical tool. There's some things there that has to do with change and conflict, because change and conflict kind of go together. In seminary, I had that class, change and conflict. But I think that Lead to Revitalize is a good book that you guys put together, we put together as convention staff. I'm a Gary McIntosh fan. I love Dr. McIntosh's writing. I love what every pastor should know. I think that's probably out of all the books he has, and I've got a couple young pastors that look at me and say, yeah, you've got every book he's written. And I said, I do. I have them all. But I like that book, and it's a great desktop book. And not only would it address some of the things we talked about today, but it'd just be a great resource for a guy. I think the Dare to Dream Again, the Robert Dale book that I mentioned, is a good book. It's got a little bit of age on it. They have improved it. It talks about, Jason, something that's near to you is the growth cycle. I think in looking at those curves and things that he talks about, I think there's some really good value there. But I'll tell you, I think a book that everybody ought to have on on their library is a Malford's book. The book's called "Look Before You Lead: How to Discern and Shape Your Church Culture." I like that book. There's a lot of practical help in that book. So those would be 3 or 4 books. As we start in that first section, and this is probably a push to some things that we have at convention. I really love the 40 days of prayer devotional that a pastor could use to help prepare his congregation or his leadership team for some change that's ahead. So I think those are some good practical tools that the pastor might want to look into.
And if you're listening to this and you are a Kentucky Baptist pastor, then reach out to your regional consultant, and he can maybe provide some of those resources or give you some other recommendations that are unique to your context. If you're outside of Kentucky, hopefully this list will be helpful for you. I'll put it in the show notes so that you can pick up some of those resources and help you in your ministry. Jeff, any final words for a new pastor who is considering implementing a major change that we haven't talked about?
Well, I guess the final words would be this is don't do it in a vacuum. Make sure you're praying about it. Make sure you're evaluating those 6 questions, but also find a good mentor. Find someone that can invest in you. And it does my heart good when I get to link pastors together as mentors and accountability guys, and that's outside of town. So that's usually helpful too. Jason, I would like to say this. Thanks to you for putting this together. I think it's a great added resource to Kentucky Baptist Convention, but also the pastors across the state, everywhere they are. But I appreciate your work and your effort in this. So thank you.
Amen. Thank you, brother. Jeff, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jason.
Well, I certainly hope that you enjoyed that conversation with Jeff Crabtree. I know that I did. And so that's it for this episode. I can't wait to join you again next week as we have another conversation about how you as a pastor can start well in your ministry. If you haven't listened to some of our previous episodes, feel free to go back and listen to those. But until next time, may you shepherd the flock of God among you well. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Starting Well podcast. For more resources, please visit us online at startingwell.net. For more information about the Kentucky Baptist Convention, go to kybaptist.org.